Like any good lawyer, I began this research for the topic by seeking out a definition. So let me share that with you. Environmental, social and governance, ESG, takes the holistic view that sustainability extends beyond just environmental issues. It's a framework that helps stakeholders understand how an organisation manages risks and opportunities around sustainability. Now, stakeholders, immediately there's an alarm bell ringing for me. For somebody of my age, you might have grown up with the idea that a company has shareholders, and most of the company's duties relate to making as much money as possible for its shareholders. But we're introducing a new term called stakeholders, which I think is intended to be wider than shareholders. So it's something of a jolt, something of an expansion in our traditional conceptions of what a company is supposed to do and who the legal duties are owed to. So already there's some new topics to grasp and some new concepts to get one's head around. Now, certainly on the coalface, ESG is undeniable. It's an undeniable factor in the market. Our own clients, our own prospective clients, are certainly making it clear to us that ESG is important to them, not just in the sense of their own activities, and many in the room, most of us in the room, are probably quite comfortable that our own activities at least pursue the E element of ESG, but also our own activities in the other areas and in our own business activities outside of fee earning. So the E, S and the G are clearly of importance to the market. Now, the theme of the conference is, of course, energy security in a net zero world towards which we're moving. As Owen mentioned, we asked the audience a series of survey questions prior to assembling you all here, and we asked a couple of questions about ESG, and I'll share the first result with you now, and maybe share the second result with you at the end of this panel. Now, the first result, and this is kind of to help define what we all think is meant by ESG, we asked the audience, what, in your view, should be the main purpose of ESG policy? And we set out 4 options, and we asked the crowd to rank them. And the leading 2 responses were the following. The first was to direct investment towards certain activities, and the second was reducing negative external impacts of business activities. So already there we have a clear presumption in the market that ESG is meant to do something. It's not just meant to be a flag to wave or something to allude to. People actually want ESG to have real world effect. Now, when we come back to the current situation and the issues around energy security, because we expect ESG to actually work, we immediately have the risk. What if ESG is in conflict with energy security, both now and as we transition towards net zero? So, there's certainly a topic there worth discussing. Now, I mentioned earlier my conceptual issues around stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? Are they a clearly identifiable group of people, or are they a disparate bunch? Now, I've got my own disparate bunch of stakeholders assembled on stage, and hopefully between us we can shed some light on the topic. I'm going to do things fairly simply. We've got the panel is called ESG Risks and Benefits. I'll go around the panel 3 times. Firstly, to have some opening comments about what ESG means to them. Secondly, what they perceive as the risks, and finally, hopefully some encouraging remarks about how we can exploit the maximum benefit from ESG as we know it. Okay, so without further ado, I'll turn to the first area. What does ESG mean to each of our panelists? And I'm going to be slightly self-indulgent and start on a relatively familiar footing by calling upon the other lawyer on the panel for the first response, my colleague Peter Johnston. Peter, what would you say ESG means to you from your own perspective as a commercial litigator?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and morning, everyone. I'm the risks element of the panel. I suppose, look, as an issue, it's grown increasingly of importance over the last few years for obvious reasons, and it's no longer really marketing spin, the ESG mantle, and it's moved as a topic into the boardroom, and it's coming up all the time, and because of that, then you get lawyers like me involved. And as a disputes lawyer, and lawyers generally, look, your job for your client is to a large extent to try and reduce their risk. And the challenge with ESG is and lawyers, we love a definition, as Peter's already sort of intimated. The challenge, if a customer or client comes to you and says, look, our ESG credentials are great or industry leading, you're like, well, look, that sounds wonderful, but what does that actually mean? And particularly from a legal context, what does that actually mean? Where are your rights and obligations in all of this? So I think the way to unpack it is effectively to consider it as an umbrella term and to break down the environmental, the social and the governance elements of the ESG moniker. And if you look at the environmental element, you're looking at sort of energy law, you're looking at pollution, emissions, think Dieselgate, the Volkswagen type scandals. If you look at the social, you're looking at sort of employee rights, consumer rights. And then you move on to governance then, you're looking at sort of directors' duties, company statements, financial crime and fraud and that sort of stuff. But I think when you look at it at that umbrella level, it's important to understand that these topics sort of intermingle. And if I could use the Dieselgate case as an example, and I appreciate it as an extreme example, it's an unusual set of circumstances, but there you had a scenario where you had a company who had an environmental fine because they had this trick device in their car which allowed them to fiddle the emissions test. They got a massive fine from the EPA in the US that's then fined throughout the world by various other regulators. And then you had the follow-on then claim from consumers. So you moved from your environmental pillar of your ESG to your social. So you had consumers, customers of Volkswagen all around the world sue them on these follow-on claims, effectively saying, well, I thought the car I was buying was this environmentally friendly when it actually transpired that it wasn't. And those cases are still going on today. So I think to your question, Peter, in terms of how I would consider it, it's important you take a step back. It's an overall umbrella term that has a number of pillars or functions that all then intersperse with one another.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And in terms of one of the issues I'm interested in is the level of compulsion that's attached to ESG. I mean, my impression is it's something that companies, now admittedly it's widespread already in the market, but it's not compulsory for companies to actually engage with ESG, is it? Or how would you view it?
No, and I think that's, again, from the risk side. At the moment, you have, certainly on the environmental side of the ESG, you see companies coming out with various statements in relation to what they're going to do. And, they're voluntary statements. There's no legal obligation for them to do certain things. But the challenge for companies is when they make these utterances now, if they're in the future, there's a delta or a difference between what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing. That's where it causes problems.
Yeah, good. Okay. I know that Sean Keyes, writing in the Currency last year, mentioned that I think because of the voluntary nature, one of the effects of ESG, and it's possibly an unintended consequence, is to kind of split the market between the ESG companies and the non-ESG companies. The same bad stuff might be going on, but it's just it's a subset of the market doing it, and that's because again it's voluntary in nature, which I thought was an interesting dynamic. Okay, well maybe moving to a maybe a systems perspective. Dr. Muireann Lynch, have you any observations or thoughts about ESG and what it means for the current issues confronting the Irish energy sector?
Yeah, so I suppose two things that jump out at me, especially listening to the previous marks, is the fact that ESG is kind of at individual company level, and then, as you said, the fact that it's voluntary. So the way that plays out from a systems perspective is you might have individual companies or indeed kind of actors, communities, whatever, that are very micro-focused and are looking to have their own activities and operations meet some set of targets, whether that's low carbon, zero carbon, whatever. However, that might guide the system, and we can talk about the electricity system, the energy system, the economy, whatever kind of macro system we want to conceptualize this through. That might guide the system to a suboptimal equilibrium. So either one where we don't get total emissions down as low as we'd like, or one where we do, but it's more expensive than it would otherwise need to have been.
Or less secure, maybe.
Or less secure, indeed. So a lot of the research that I do is on integrated energy systems. And one example of a research project that was really interesting but really, really difficult was about electricity demand response from a wastewater treatment plant. Now, wastewater treatment plant operators are aware of the fact that they have some inbuilt redundancies in their plant, which means they can actually operate the plant a bit more flexibly while meeting all of the environmental standards on the effluent. So basically the water coming out is sufficiently clean, but providing some flexibility to the grid. But up until now, they had been figuring this out through the basis of, I'll pull back my kind of operations when the electricity price is high, I'll ramp them up when the electricity price is low. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to take that resource of flexibility from wastewater treatment plant, but see how would the system operator make best use of this flexibility. So in that case, what you might actually do is you might want them to ramp up their usage, not necessarily when the wind is low or when the wind is high, but maybe in order to avoid a unit shutting off and therefore avoiding that high shutdown cost and then the subsequent high startup cost. That's something that would never have fed through to the wastewater treatment company's balance sheet. They're never going to get that benefit of avoiding shutting off and then restarting a coal plant, or avoiding shutting off and restarting a distillate plant and avoiding all the associated emissions. So I think trying to find a way to get from that macro level to the micro level is the challenge here. And then the market splitting that you mentioned as well feeds into that as well. The fact that it's voluntary, it means that companies that are opting in may actually be less able to do something for the system than some of the companies that are opting out. So we may be missing low-hanging fruit.
And I'm just thinking, I'm not an engineer, but to me, from my remove, a system that's currently designed to emit carbon, let's face it, transitioning to a system where there's a net zero constraint is a huge technical challenge, but it's a system challenge, and I can't imagine how you do that without some firm top-down guidance from the system and the operators and the licensing authorities. And yet, as we're grappling towards a definition, it seems that ESG is more of a bottom-up. So to me, it's kind of marrying those two dynamics.
Exactly, and you need to incorporate. If I were to model this, what I would be saying is I'd be looking at the incentives to participate in ESG, and I'd be turning them into, I suppose, a constraint on the policymaker's problem. So the policymaker's problem is to get to whatever the carbon target it is, taking account of what everybody else wants to do. And if ESG is something that other people might want to do, then the policymaker has to include that in their problem solving. Otherwise, the solution that they arrive at and the policies, the enabling policies that they arrive at will not be fit for purpose.
Right, so it almost makes it more complex.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Well, turning maybe to Paul now, who's coming from a perspective of a company firmly aligned with ESG goals, in the trenches, looking for projects, developing projects, and hopefully moving in the same direction as the system requirements. What are your observations, Paul, on ESG and what it means to you?
I suppose at a macro level, I see ESG being really like a recipe. And if we get that recipe right, and if we have really high quality ingredients going into that recipe, I think to use a kind of an analogy, we will all get to enjoy a very good cake in the future, as Philip refers to the children and the grandchildren coming along. But it's very important that ESG is not just about renewable energy. It's much, much broader than that. And I suppose that, what I see is that ESG policies and strategies in companies are actually being developed in response to funding and investment. And it really is coming from that top level down. And even though it may not be something that's obligated on a company, I think that the changes in reporting that are coming down the line this year and next year, where companies of a scale need to report on their ESG policies and their targets on an annual basis, I think it's going to be even more crucial. But when you bring it down to renewables, we really do address the E, the S, and the G, where we're reducing carbon emissions through renewable energy and taken away from fossil fuel generation. On a social basis, we have a very good system here where local communities can gain directly from the development of renewable energy projects. So that addresses the social piece. On environmental, you also have the biodiversity piece, which is very important to renewable energy developers. And then on the governance piece, very topical in the last few weeks, it's crucial that we address security of supply and energy pricing. And I think that comes at the very top level of governance.
Yeah, well-made observation about the social elements of the community-based schemes that are certainly present in the res regime. I suppose the uptake possibly with those hasn't been as much as the government might have hoped. I mean, do you have any reflections on why that might or might not have happened, or is it overly complex as
I actually think the element within RES for community benefit is very straightforward, and I think it's very helpful that it is straightforward. But I have to say that above and beyond what might be stipulated in RES, I find, again, going back to the collaboration that we heard about earlier between developers, I genuinely feel that renewable developers very much want to work with local communities. And we want to be a part of the community, we want to be good neighbours, and we want to share the benefits of any scheme with the local community. So I think it's much broader than what RES has set out.
Okay, yeah, good point. Professor Foley, what observations do you have on ESG and through the research you've been doing?
Okay, I suppose, look, I'm sort of a different animal in that I spent 12 years in industry, so I would work for Siemens, ASBI, SWS and PM, so I would have done a lot of this. But putting on my academic hat and then working with government, so working with the Treasury in the UK and stuff like that, and DEFI up north and BES, to me it's more about de-risking impacts of climate change on markets and investments. So that's the first thing, that's the key thing, okay? After that then, it's about reorientating capital flows into sustainable finance, making it more mainstream, and then having a longer term investment. So then if we look at, say, green and brown funds, and investments, the old sin funds, they're always going to make money, okay? So people are always going to gamble, they're always going to drive their car, okay? So if we're talking about green funds then, and offshore wind, it's great, and hydrogen is great, but they're only a small portion of the market, because we're locked into carbon until maybe 2075. So 2050 is a great target, but we're locked into natural gas, we're locked into kerosene, we're locked into diesel oil, we're locked into a lot of products that we use at the moment. So then if we drill down further and we look at environment, social aspects and governments, to me the environment is the carbon market. It's IPPC licensing, it's traditional EIA. So the headache here for a lot of, I did wind farms, developers is EIA and dealing with the public, okay? But the issue there, and where people run into difficulties, is where they're a little bit fast and easy with the regulations, or somebody makes a mistake in a planning application, or somebody makes a mistake when they're constructing a wind farm after the fact. They're the issues where you run into problems, or you don't communicate adequately with the locals. So I remember when I was in ESPI, I did one, it was a 220 to 110 kV substation and overhead lines. It's actually for the Aoife, so it's for the Irish-France interconnector. And it was the first time that a planning application had never gone to on board Planala for a high voltage power line in the history of the state. And I remember going down and I met the head guy in ESB, I can't remember his name at the time, and he brought me for pints in Foley's. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, because actually what I did was I went and I spoke to every farmer, every landowner, and one of the guys who was going to object, he said to me, I don't want this running through my farm. Well, I said, I hate to tell you, Bosch and Lom isn't going to be there if we don't have this line. And this is the honesty and the dialogue that you have to have with people. It's the same with the politicians. In terms of then, say, the carbon market. So at the moment, carbon is trading at about 73 euros a tonne. So it's come down from 100 and odd, because basically what's happening is steel plants, aluminium plants, fertiliser plants have been closing across the EU, so they're not going to exceed their IPPC licence threshold. So there's going to be no need for them to buy carbon. But what's happening is then investors have moved into hedging in gas markets, so we have an Enron situation. They're making a lot of money very quickly. So that's actually what the key of ESG. It's not about really the micro of hydrogen, the micro of wind. It's a broader sort of strategic approach to investment. And that's what will make markets work.
So what I'm hearing is that even in the days before ESG became a conference buzzword, on the ground you were behaving as if, as people currently behave under ESG. It's nothing new in that sense.
No, it's not. And if you look at the social and governance aspects, and I said talking to the guys in the community, it's also about your investor, your shareholder, your board, your employees, and the community. So it's about happier people doing a better job in the framework of sustainability. So that's really what ESG is about. if you take a long-term sort of perspective.
Yeah, and has always been about, I guess. So moving to the risks associated with ESG, Dr. Lynch, anything to or bothering you about the concept?
Well, I suppose getting back to the interface between ESG and policy, and how do they interact, and how do we craft policy taking the appetite for ESG into account, and the fact that it's voluntary. One of the rules of thumb of policy, if you like, is you should have one policy per objective, and that principle tends to get violated in both directions. So we like to have loads and loads and loads of policies to support one objective, and then we like individual policies to support multiple objectives. So those who may remember after the 2011 election, we always had kind of three pillars of energy policy, which were sustainability, affordability, and security. But job creation suddenly entered into the picture as well. And now every single energy policy had to also be crafted through the lens of job creation. How many jobs will it create? Because that election was all about jobs, and it was a main policy plank of that government. And then on the flip side, you kind of say, well, we want to lower emissions. Might this here thing lower emissions? Yeah, probs. We'd better subsidise it, without necessarily kind of consideration being given to how these various subsidies and schemes interact and undermine each other. So one really good example would be the fact that we had simultaneous targets we set really high wind targets in 2007, which we met in 2020. But we also had other targets, so for things like a certain amount of combined heat and power. Now, combined heat and power is great for lowering emissions, but it kind of works well when you have high electricity prices, but wind depresses electricity prices. So we're coming up with two different policies to achieve the same goal, that of reducing emissions, that actually contradict each other. So what I would say is, getting back to the ESG lens, it's important to make sure that whatever way policy is crafted, it takes account of what ESG is doing, it takes account of how ESG is steering investment and is directing activity. Policy needs to not repeat what's already happening voluntarily, and maybe drive investment in areas where ESG isn't touching, or possibly find a way to compound rather than undermine the benefits of voluntary activity via ESG or other means. So I'd say that would be the main risk, would come down to a lack of interaction in a consistent manner between ESG and policy.
Yep, so you'd have different policies conflicting with each other and also conflicting with the behavioural trends that are evident, or the incentives at a micro level. Yeah, okay, good observations there. Paul, from your perspective, the risks, the downsides.
How long have we got? I suppose I always say all economic development starts with planning. And I owned a planning consultancy in Belfast from 2003. So we've dealt with it for a long time now, and transferred it across into renewables. And I suppose we're developing renewable projects at two different scales. So we have utility scale, where we have about 900 megawatts of solar in development and 800 megawatts of battery storage. And then on the C&I side, we're developing projects in partnership with large energy users where we can supply renewable electricity directly with private wire behind the meter. But I suppose in planning there really is a tension between the E and the S, where we want to do something very positive for the environment, but yet the social side in some locations is utterly against. And you know, we have one project where 110 megawatts of solar, council has approved it, but a handful of neighbours have sent it to the board for a third-party appeal. It doesn't help when 6 Green Party councillors support those objectors to take it to appeal, and that's where there's definitely a conflict. So we need more support on the G from government to make changes in the planning process. We have one project which, again, I think Deirdre mentioned earlier about the the guideline time of 18 weeks for onboard Planola. We have one project with the board, it's now 57 weeks. But the problem with that is that it's still with the board, and yet the ECP process for grid connections only opens once a year, and that's in September. So that project has now missed this year's application for grid. And if we were to get the decision from the board in the first week in October, the project has been delayed by a year anyway. So there's no joined up piece there. We need to have clarity in the process linking planning through to grid. And then even once you do apply into ECP, we secured the largest project in Ireland last year on the ECP batch list at 185 megawatts. And 1 year later, we still don't have a grid offer. So, if the targets are there that we are all striving to meet by 2030, then we need to streamline the process. We need to get everybody resourced and working towards actually delivering the targets. I mean, Climate Action Plan, I think, came out first in 2019. How many of the actions have been ticked off and completed? That's what we need to get to, is actual delivery from government. And I suppose the Repower EU paper, which has been referred to a few times, it's really, really helpful. It sets the roadmap of how we should deliver. But as the Minister suggested earlier, 12-month approval in designated areas. How long will it take councils in Ireland to designate areas? So that's the starting point. So there are many, many issues and risks that face developers in actually delivering projects.
I think it's nigh on impossible to convene a panel at an Irish energy conference without planning and grid being mentioned, and no exception here. But I mean, the devil's advocate in me would say that the planning system is an example of stakeholder capitalism at work. Although I guess you'd probably complain that there are too many stakeholders allowed a view, and often their stake is questionable.
I have always been one for stakeholder engagement. Indeed, our planning company actually won a UK award for stakeholder engagement, where we actually went out, as Aoife mentioned herself, we went out and engaged directly with neighbours, and we still do that on each project. But unfortunately, in some areas, you just will not get over, to put it bluntly, NIMBYs. And those handful of people are stopping a project which is bringing national benefit.
And Professor Foley, have you any observations at this point about the risks?
I suppose the risk is there's too many global standards at the moment. So if you look at ESG, it's a bit of an ad hoc, and it's apart from the UK, it's really voluntary. So you've the World Economic Forum, you've the UNEP principles for responsible banking, you've the Equator principles, you've the Global Compact, you've Net Zero Banking Alliance. There's just oodles of these, so who do you saddle your horse to? So then the next thing is, because there's so many of them out there, it's creating a bit of greenwashing. So, and then what that does, then it gives the wrong signals to the market, and then investors will complain about it and say it's an unnecessary, bunch of paperwork, which lawyers will make a lot of money out of. I think it really should be sitting more with the accountancy aspects of finance, with some engineering in it, more of an ISO type standard. We can see it already with the UK Financial Regulatory Authority. The task force for climate-related financial disclosures now is mandatory, and that was done tying back into COP in Glasgow. And I think that's really, really important. And then if you look at sort of globally, and I've done planning applications in different EU member states and outside of the EU. And to be quite honest, one of the previous panel, I think she's a lawyer for panel members, she mentioned really people have the right to object. And we live in a democracy. We don't live in Russia, okay? So, to be quite honest, I think it's the issue with energy projects and the issue with any projects is it's a bit like the Wild West at the moment, okay? So everybody wants to fling a battery out. Everybody wants to stick a wind turbine up. And at the moment, I'm involved in looking at offshore wind for Northern Ireland in the working group. And, that process is going to be developer-led, or is it going to be Crown Estates-led? And are you going to do it as a sort of a national interest, or are you going to leave developers sort of decide what they want to do? So it's like hydrogen pipelines and wires, privatisation of them. You know, if you're a local authority person, or you're in the NRA in Ireland, the National Roads Authority, well, the NTA now as it's called, you know, the last thing you need is some guy who wants to put a hydrogen pipeline down your motorway and he's not going to reinstate it properly. That has a net impact on the overall economy. So, you know, it's about better land use, transport, energy and economic planning for the country. And I don't understand why, if I look at Ireland PLC or Limited, whatever you want to call it, and if I look at what happens is, you know, even between the ministers, they have different opinions. Even between the departments, they have different opinions. And, you know, the conversation with the Department of Finance and Revenue in relation to how we'll pass on €400 or €200 to the public and how to make impact for the people who most need it is lost in the discussion. Because it's a bit of PR and a clickbait for a politician for a few votes. So this is the problem. So we have a democracy and we all vote, but we're not voting. So this all then ties back into ESG. So to me, if you want to maximise your ESG policies, you have better governance in your whole system.
Yeah, and that kind of echoes back to the...
and then you have better signals to the market.
Yes, and that almost echoes back to Dr. Lynch's top-down versus bottom-up tension, I think, and
Yeah.
especially if the bottom-up is guided by a confusing, multiple set of potential ESG standards, which are murky to some. Peter, from a legal perspective, and you're all about the risks, I hear. So, what have you got for us?
I suppose, you know, the legal risks around ESG are still pretty much in their infancy because it's a relatively new concept. And in fact, sometimes the risks are more around the commercial damage to your reputation, damage to your, you know, relationship with your funders, your ability to get finance with your consumers or your customers. But from the legal perspective, I think you can break the risks down into sort of two main headings. You've first got the regulatory risk, and then you've separately got sort of private law claims. And when you look at regulatory risk, I suspect a lot of people in this room over the last 10 years, whatever industry you're in, your regulator has never been more vocal. You're subject to way more regulation than you ever have been. And if you get something wrong, the likelihood of enforcement action is probably, you know, more likely to happen now than ever before. And that trend of increased regulation is what you're now seeing over certainly the last year or so in ESG. And what you're seeing internationally, certainly at the moment, is a lot of regulators, you know, what I'm calling the hunt for greenwashing, is they're actively going out to the market and, you know, sense checking what, funds are doing, what companies are saying in relation to their green credentials. So in the US, there's been a number of fines this year already in relation to this. I think quite interestingly, from an Irish perspective, is the CBI has set up their own internal unit in relation to this and say they're going to start focusing on greenwashing. The Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, in just July, they're gone, have launched an investigation into fast fashion brands, Boohoo and ASOS, where they're looking into effectively what they are saying to the market and to consumers in relation to their green credentials. And I think it's the outcome of those types of investigations that we're going to see over the next 18 months or so is going to have a significant impact on this jurisdiction. And then I suppose when you turn to the private law claims, they break down into two. One is your follow-on claim. So Dieselgate is the prime example of a follow-on claim where you have consumers from a regulatory fine. Consumers then have a cause of action against a particular manufacturer. The other main types of claims is effectively shareholders, investors, you know, bringing claims against companies and their directors for basically the difference between what they said they would do and what they're actually doing in practice in relation to their ESG statements. And if I was to crystal ball gaze at all in relation to any of this from an Irish perspective, I think what we will see certainly in the main focus over the next 2 to 3 years will be the follow-on claims. There's new legislation coming in around consumer collective class actions, which is coming into law next year in Ireland, which is going to be a big change generally. And I think this is one of the areas where you're going to see a lot more, from a company's perspective, a risk around that sort of issue.
Certainly in terms of your comments about regulation, I mean, it's almost like a law of nature. Regulation expands to fill the available headspace. It's only Donald Trump's Washington where regulations are ever removed, and then only temporarily. So, yeah, it's some good points there. Just in the interest of trying to end on a positive note before we head to the coffee break, Muireann, from your point of view, how can the benefits of ESG best be unlocked?
Yeah, so I would say getting more information and more transparency out can really help in terms of moving from that micro to a systems perspective. So one of the things that I've been doing a lot lately is talking about electricity markets in the media. And I've got, my dad's cousins ringing me up and saying, is that really how it works? I didn't know, kind of thing. And I think what this might do is it might broaden the opportunity for activities that can be perceived by stakeholders, whether that's shareholders, board members, whomever, as ESG. So instead of saying, we installed something in order to make our particular plant more efficient, you can say something like, we entered into a smart communications contract with another company in order to provide more flexibility to the grid. So this means that you're able to contribute to the system while also selling that, or not in a pejorative way, but actually contributing toward ESG. I think we also need to be realistic in our goals and our policies and be honest about what is and isn't achievable. And anything anyone can do to increment toward those goals and policies is great. But if we're coming at this from the point of view of it needs to be 100% or else it doesn't count, then we're not going to get there, because again, we'll get locked into that micro level side of things.
Yeah, I'd like some of your comments in the media from other events about the need to maybe be more public and be more open about what net zero might cost us, because often, the goal is described, but not so much the costs and the potential impacts upon each of us. And I think you've been quite vociferous and rightly so in bringing out the importance of that issue, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we learned from COVID is how quickly we can react under severe pressure. And I'm seeing that quick reaction again now regarding potential blackouts, regarding super high fossil fuel prices. We didn't get that speed, that urgency, when the only crisis we were dealing with was the climate crisis. And the truth of the matter is, in order to meet our climate targets, we have to do a ridiculous amount of work, and it's going to be incredibly costly. And unless we're upfront about that, and maybe stop selling it as some kind of a win-win-win, which just isn't the case, then we may make increments, but we're not going to hit the goals.
Very good. Yeah, there's been plenty of fodder for the behavioural scientists over the last few years, that's for
Yes.
sure. Paul, moving to you, and we have to probably hurry along because we're under a wee bit of time pressure. But what's your thoughts on how ESG could best be unlocked in terms of benefits?
Well, the one really good thing is there's lots of funding available. So normally there would be times you would speak at a conference like this and you would have bankers actually throwing 50s up onto the stage for the right projects.
Can I go to those conferences?
But so the funding is there to enable it to happen if all of those other pieces can come together. I suppose quick wins that would really enable more progress to be made. As Barry mentioned previously, we absolutely need private wire legislation enacted, and I mean within the next 3 to 6 months. It's been sitting around. It needs to be brought through.
Well, I think we have legislation, just we don't have an administrative kind of system behind that. I mean, it's there in the statute book and has been for years, but it's just not being.
We need to enable it. There are many large energy users out there who would like to have direct renewable energy supply, and we can't deliver it for them. So that's one piece that government can really take action on and ensure it happens. The next piece, going back to security of supply, we need to change the ECP rule set for battery storage connection applications. We have 300 megawatts of battery storage on one site. We can't get a connection offer because it doesn't meet the criteria that is set down in the ECP rule set. That's just ludicrous. I mean, Mark Foley presented earlier to say that there's a shortfall of 280 megawatts in this peak time. Well, battery storage can contribute. I'm not saying it's the sole solution, but battery storage can contribute to that security of supply issue that we have at peak times. But unless we can get major projects through the connection process quickly, then we can't offer.
So you'd like more victories from the bottom up over the top down in those kind of areas? Yeah. Yep. No. Thanks. Aoife, anything you could recommend?
I suppose first thing anyway is an alignment in the reporting. So that needs to be done. The second thing, the EU taxonomy, and the metrics that are out there for reporting, that needs to be aligned as well. There needs to be a single clear materiality process, standards process, sustainability process, because then you'll avoid your greenwashing, and it will also be avoided then in other sectors like housing, transport, clothing, manufacturing and pharma. So if you've a cobalt mine or a lithium ion mine, or you're making runners out in Taiwan or wherever, Vietnam, there is a moral obligation there, and there's a carbon footprint associated with that and its shipment. Then in terms of, what companies can do, I really think it's about time now that there was an ESG expert in every board, preferably an engineer, okay? Because if I look at boards and I see who's on them, and I've been buying stocks since I was 18 or 19 years of age, it's a bit of a hobby of mine. What I find ironic is you have an accountant, you have a financier, you have sales guys. Only really in engineering companies will you have engineers. So I think that's an issue in other sectors. So I think there should be an ESG expert on boards. It should be mandatory. And I suppose if I look at, if we go back to the TCFD guidelines, they're very, very important. And I think we need something like that in Ireland if we're meant to be a green economy. Now, I know the central bank is forming a group at the moment, but that again is going to be voluntary. So I'd have an issue about that. I suppose, look, if you put it in terms, and if you go back to Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, he did a really interesting interview in The Economist there years ago, and he said the energy crisis, and the energy crisis is now. And I suppose, I've been modelling, and analysing this for years, and I'm running some numbers at the moment, and this is the problem. In the olden days, in the 50s and 60s, when we did large capital infrastructure projects as engineers for government, and capital was leveraged over a long-term bond, we did a cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis has seemed to have gone out the window. And in that, you would then societise and do the econometrics to run the costs and find out how much would it cost each citizen in the state. And how would we get that money back in a revenue or a tax or a charge? That's missing in this targets, because we've become so hung up on emissions. It's all about emissions to the detriment of good engineering. So we had 30 years of wave energy, which didn't deliver. Now we have the hydrogen highway. And this isn't the second, this is the third reincarnation of the hydrogen highway. The cheapest way to make hydrogen is from fossil fuels. There's no two ways about it. Carbon capture, storage and utilisation is going to be the last mile. It's going to be for large emitters of carbon. It's not going to be for small countries. Ireland is a small country. Us talking about it, really, we're not going to emit that volume of carbon with the current technology that's out there. So they're the issues. Storage is important to Ireland. So if we look at the problem at the moment, why was Kinsale decommissioned without any backup for gas storage on the island of Ireland? It's farcical. With some dream of having an LNG with cheap gas coming from the US. So that's, the market goes up. Of course the Yanks are going to sell the gas at the same price as Europe. They're in it to make money, they're investors. They're not there for the fun of it. So this is all about ESG, and they're the issues that we have. There's a bit of a sort of a short-term vision there. It really needs to be more long-term.
Okay,
so they're the benefits, if you do the right thing.
A lot of issues there with the policy balance as it currently obtains. Peter, anything from a legal perspective?
I think just quick final comments from me. I suppose conscious that, we've talked about these are the risks. What can you do now? I think there's two things you can do now, which are fairly basic at any organisational level, is understand your regulatory framework and be up to date. The days of when your regulator would sort of, was in mode of educating the industry around things are long gone. You've no excuse not to be up to date with your regulation requirements. And then the second thing, as I mentioned earlier, most of the cases around these types of issues, or a lot of the cases around, are the delta or the difference between what companies are saying they're doing to the market and what they're actually doing in practice. and to view your sort of public announcements and statements with that lens to identify that delta, because ultimately that's what claimants' lawyers do ultimately down the road if there's ever to be litigation.
Good. There we go. So those are our views on ESG, and it's now, as the coffee break looms, I just want to finish with the other piece of data we got out of the pre-conference survey about ESG. And we asked the audience on ESG policy, which of the following statements do you agree with the most? And this is a bit of good news to end on in view of the topic of the conference. It should be possible to achieve energy security while also pursuing the environmental aims of ESG policy, was the most popular position. So the audience, at least, the market at least, thinks that the two can coexist, energy security and ESG, and let's hope that's the case. So thank you very much to the panellists, and thank you for listening.